Picture yourself sitting in a quiet room. The day has ended. The noise has stopped. And here, in the stillness, a question arrives. Why does it hurt? Not just the physical pain, though that is real enough, but the other kind, the ache that has no clear location, the heaviness that settles in when everything should be fine. You are not the first person to sit with this question. For 25 centuries, the greatest minds in human history have turned toward suffering the way a traveler turns toward a distant mountain, unavoidable, immense, and somehow central to the entire journey. Tonight, we are going to walk through that history together, not as a lecture, not as a catalogue of names and dates, but as a conversation that has been unfolding across generations, each thinker responding to the one who came before, each era offering its own answer to the same persistent question. What is suffering? Where does it come from? And is there a way through it that does not require pretending it does not exist? The Buddha sat beneath a tree and named it. The Stoics built a philosophy to endure it. The existentialists dared to find meaning inside it. And the modern psychologists mapped how it lives in the body long after the mind has moved on. Some of these answers will feel ancient and distant, others will feel uncomfortably close. But somewhere in this long conversation, you may find something that shifts gently, the way you hold your own pain tonight. There are two kinds of suffering that philosophy has always recognized. The first is the suffering that happens to you, the loss, the accident, the diagnosis, the ending you did not choose. The second is the suffering you add to the first, the story you tell about the loss, the spiral of worry, the belief that it should not have happened, the refusal to accept what already is. Hold that distinction lightly. We will return to it. For now, just know this. The history of philosophy is not a history of eliminating pain. It is a history of understanding it. And understanding, it turns out, is a kind of medicine. Let your shoulders drop for just a moment. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You just need to listen. The thinkers we're about to meet, they were people like you. They struggled, they doubted. They lay awake at night wondering if any of it made sense, and then they tried to put words to what they felt. Those words have survived. Not because they were perfect, but because they were true enough to help someone else centuries later feel a little less alone. So we begin where the conversation began, 2,500 years ago, in a garden in northern India, with a man who gave up a kingdom to sit beneath a tree and ask one simple question: why do we suffer? Chapter 2, The Buddha and the Four Noble Truths. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was born into royalty, raised in a palace, sheltered from every form of pain his father could keep hidden. For 29 years, he lived inside walls designed to protect him from the truth. But walls only hold so long. One day, he left the palace, and he saw 4 things. An old man bent with age, a sick man trembling with fever, a corpse being carried toward the cremation grounds, and finally a wandering monk, calm in the face of it all. That night, Siddhartha left the palace forever. He shaved his head, he gave up his wealth, and he sat beneath a tree until he understood. What he understood became the foundation of Buddhist philosophy. 4 simple truths about suffering, not complicated, not esoteric, just clear. The first noble truth: suffering exists. It is not a mistake or a punishment. It is woven into the fabric of life. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering. Being separated from what you love is suffering. Being stuck with what you hate is suffering. Not getting what you want is suffering. This was not pessimism. It was realism. The Buddha was not saying life is only suffering. He was saying, stop pretending it does not exist. Look at it directly. Name it. The second noble truth: suffering has a cause. And the cause is not external, it is internal. The cause is craving, wanting things to be different than they are, clinging to pleasure, pushing away pain, demanding permanence in a world where nothing lasts. Think of it this way. Imagine you are holding an ice cube in your hand. At first, it feels cold, refreshing. You close your fist around it, trying to keep it, but the ice begins to melt. Water drips between your fingers. The cold becomes painful. Your hand starts to ache. The suffering is not the ice itself. It is the grip. The third noble truth: suffering can end. Not by eliminating pain from the world, but by releasing the craving that turns pain into suffering. This is where the Buddha parts ways with many who came after him. He did not promise transcendence, he promised release, a letting go, a loosening of the fist. And the fourth noble truth: there is a path out. Not a miracle, not a savior, just a practice. 8 disciplines that train the mind to stop craving and start seeing. Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Concentration. Notice the word right. Not perfect, not pure, just aligned, pointed in the direction of less suffering, not more. For the Buddha, suffering was not something to philosophize about from a distance. It was something to understand from the inside, by sitting with it, by watching how the mind reacts, by noticing the moment craving arises and choosing not to feed it. He taught this for 45 years, walking from village to village, speaking to anyone who would listen. And when he died, his final words were simple: all things pass, strive diligently, even the teacher, even the teaching, even the suffering itself. Here is what the Buddha saw that night beneath the tree. Suffering is not the enemy, craving is. And once you see that clearly, something in you can finally rest. Let your breath slow for just a moment. The Buddha's insight was radical for his time, and it remains radical now. because it asks you to stop looking for someone to blame, stop waiting for life to get easier, and start noticing the one thing you can actually change. Not the pain, the relationship to it. But the Buddha was not the only voice in the ancient world. Far to the west, in the hills of Greece, other philosophers were beginning to ask the same question, and they arrived at very different answers. Chapter 3. Heraclitus and the Logic of Flux. Heraclitus lived in Ephesus, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, around 500 BCE. He was known for being difficult, cryptic. He wrote in fragments, short, riddling sentences that forced the reader to think, and his central claim was this: everything flows. Panta rai, all things flow. You cannot step into the same river twice, he said, because the river is always changing, and so are you. The water that touched your foot a moment ago is already downstream. The person who stepped in is already different than the person who steps out. For Heraclitus, suffering was not a mistake in the design of the universe. It was proof that the universe was working exactly as it should. Change is the law, not an exception, not a problem to solve, the law. Birth requires death. Growth requires decay. Harmony emerges from tension. Order arises from chaos. He wrote, "The path up and the path down are one and the same," meaning this: what rises must fall. What falls can rise again. The cycle is not cruel. It is honest. Think of a flame. A flame is not a thing. It is a process. Wood becomes heat, becomes light, becomes ash. And yet we point to the flame and say, "There, that is fire." But if you tried to hold the flame still, it would cease to be fire. Heraclitus believed we are like that, not solid objects moving through time, but processes, patterns of change, mistaking ourselves for permanence. And suffering arises whenever we forget this. When you cling to a moment and demand it stay. When you resist a loss and insist it should not have happened. When you freeze your identity and refuse to let it shift. You are trying to step into the same river twice. And the river does not care. Heraclitus was not gentle about this. He did not offer comfort. He offered clarity. If everything is flux, then the suffering you feel right now, this too is changing. It will not stay. It cannot stay. Even as you hold it, it is already becoming something else. And the self that suffers, also in flux? The version of you that experienced the loss is not the version of you remembering it now. You have already stepped out of that river. The water that hurt you is downstream. This is where Heraclitus becomes useful at night, when your mind is replaying something that cannot be undone. The event is over. It is not happening now. What is happening now is the memory. And the memory is also changing. Every time you revisit it, you reshape it slightly, add a new shadow, remove a detail, sharpen an edge. You are not reliving the past. You are creating a new version of it in the present. And if that is true, then you have more power than you think. Not to change what happened, but to change your relationship to what happened. To step out of the river, to let it flow past. Heraclitus died alone, bitter, living in the mountains. His philosophy did not make him happy, but it made him right. And sometimes being right is a strange kind of consolation. The logic of flux is not warm, but it is true. And truth, even uncomfortable truth, can be a kind of relief. Let that settle for a moment. There is something here that will return later. The idea that suffering might not require a villain, that it might simply be the cost of being alive in a world that refuses to stand still. But other philosophers were not satisfied with this answer. They wanted more. They wanted to know not just that suffering exists, but why it seems so often to be unjust. And for that, we turn to Athens. Chapter 4, Socrates on ignorance and harm. Socrates never wrote anything down. Everything we know about him comes from his students, especially Plato, who made him the central character in nearly every dialogue. Socrates wandered the streets of Athens, stopping people and asking them questions, not to teach, to expose, to reveal that what they thought they knew, they did not actually understand. And his central claim about suffering was this: no one does evil willingly. All harm comes from ignorance. If you truly understood what was good, you would do it. If you lie, cheat, harm another person, it is because you are confused about what will actually make you happy. This sounds absurd at first. People harm others all the time, knowing full well it is wrong. The thief knows stealing is wrong. The liar knows lying is wrong. They do it anyway. But Socrates would say, they do not truly know. They have an opinion, a belief, but not knowledge. True knowledge is not intellectual. It is transformative. If you genuinely understood that cruelty makes you miserable, you would stop being cruel. Not because you are moral, because you are rational. Here is where this becomes useful for suffering. If Socrates is right, then the harm you carry, whether inflicted by others or by yourself, came from ignorance, not malice. The person who hurt you did not understand what they were doing. And you, when you hurt yourself through self-criticism or regret or rumination, do not understand what you are doing either. You think you are protecting yourself, or motivating yourself, or preparing yourself. But you are just confused about what helps. Socrates spent his life trying to wake people up from that confusion. He called it the examined life, the life that asks, what do I actually know? And what am I just repeating because someone told me it was true? He was executed for this, charged with corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Given a choice between exile and death, he chose death. Because for Socrates, a life unexamined was not worth living, and a death with integrity was worth more than a life spent pretending. On his final day, he drank the hemlock calmly. His students wept, and he told them not to mourn. He said, I do not know what comes after death. But I know I have lived as well as I could, and that is enough. Socrates did not eliminate suffering, but he gave it a meaning. Suffering, for him, was not pointless. It was a teacher. It revealed where you were still confused, where you had not yet thought deeply enough, where you were living someone else's values instead of your own. And once you saw that clearly, the suffering could become a doorway, not to happiness, but to truth. And truth, he believed, was the only foundation solid enough to build a life on. Notice something here. We have moved from the Buddha's diagnosis, suffering comes from craving, to Heraclitus's observation, suffering comes from resisting change, to Socrates' claim, suffering comes from ignorance. These are not contradictions, they are angles. Each one sees something true. Each one offers a way through, and the conversation is just beginning. Chapter 5. Plato's Divided Soul. Plato was Socrates' student. But where Socrates asked questions, Plato built systems. He wanted to understand not just that suffering exists, but why human beings are so consistently torn. Why do we know what is good and still choose what is harmful? Why does the mind say one thing and the body do another? Why does reason lose to desire over and over again? Plato's answer: the soul is divided, not into two parts, into three. First, there is reason, the part of you that thinks, plans, understands, judges. This is the charioteer, holding the reins. Second, there is spirit, the part of you that feels pride, anger, honor, shame. This is the noble horse, strong and responsive to reason. Third, there is appetite, the part of you that wants pleasure, avoids pain, seeks comfort, fears discomfort. This is the wild horse, pulling toward whatever feels good in the moment. Suffering, for Plato, happens when these three are at war. When reason says, "Do not send that email," and appetite says, "But it will feel good to say it," and spirit says, "They need to know I am right," the charioteer pulls one way, the horses pull another, and the soul tears itself apart. Think of a night when you could not sleep because you were replaying an argument. Reason knows the argument is over. There is nothing to gain by rehearsing it again. But spirit is still wounded, still insisting you were wronged, still demanding vindication. An appetite wants the comfort of resolution, even if resolution is impossible. So the mind circles, and the body lies awake. And you suffer not because of the argument itself, but because your soul is divided against itself. Plato believed the solution was harmony, not eliminating desire or spirit, but bringing them under the guidance of reason. The charioteer does not kill the horses, he learns to direct them. This is where Plato becomes practical. If suffering comes from inner division, then peace comes from inner order. And inner order requires training. You train reason through philosophy, through asking hard questions, through not accepting easy answers. You train spirit through courage, through standing up for what you believe, through refusing to be ruled by shame or fear of others' judgment. You train appetite through moderation, through learning to delay gratification, through experiencing that you can survive discomfort and come out stronger. None of this is fast. None of it is easy. But it is possible. Plato wrote about a cave. In the cave, people sit chained, watching shadows on a wall. They think the shadows are reality. They argue about which shadow is which. They suffer when the shadows disappoint them. And then one person breaks free, climbs out of the cave, sees the sun, realizes the shadows were not real, returns to tell the others. And the others do not believe him. They think he is insane. They prefer the shadows. Suffering, for Plato, is living in the cave and not knowing it. Mistaking shadows for substance. Mistaking opinion for knowledge. Mistaking pleasure for goodness. And the way out is not comfort. It is clarity. It requires leaving the familiar darkness, climbing toward a light that hurts your eyes at first, seeing things as they actually are, not as you wish they were. This is not gentle. Plato knew that. But he believed it was the only path to a life that did not collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. You do not have to agree with him, but notice what he saw, that you are not one unified self. You are a conversation between parts, and suffering often happens when those parts stop talking to each other and start fighting instead. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Plato's vision was grand, almost too grand. His ideal state, his philosopher kings, his perfect forms in a world beyond this one. But his student, Aristotle, brought philosophy back down to earth, and in doing so, he found a different answer to suffering. Chapter 6, Aristotle and Tragic Catharsis. Aristotle was Plato's student for 20 years. But where Plato looked upward toward perfect forms, Aristotle looked outward toward the messy, complicated world as it actually is. He studied biology, politics, ethics, rhetoric, theatre. And in his study of theatre, he discovered something about suffering that would echo for centuries. He called it catharsis, purification through emotion. Here is what he noticed. In Greek tragedy, the audience watches a hero suffer, not a villain, a hero. Someone noble, admirable, who makes one mistake, one error in judgment, and everything unravels. Oedipus, Antigone, Agamemnon. The audience knows what is coming, the characters do not. And the gap between what we know and what they know creates an unbearable tension. We watch them walk toward their doom. We want to shout a warning. But the play continues, and the suffering unfolds. And then something strange happens. The audience does not leave the theatre traumatized. They leave the theatre relieved, lighter, as if something heavy has been set down. Aristotle called this catharsis, the purging of pity and fear through witnessing suffering in a safe space. Why does this matter for real life? Because it suggests something radical. Suffering can be transformed through witnessing, through naming, through seeing it contained in a story with a beginning, middle, and end. When you sit in your room at night and your mind circles the same painful memory, it has no shape, no boundary. It feels infinite, inescapable. But if you could step back just slightly and see it as a story with characters and choices and consequences, something shifts. Not that the pain goes away, but that it stops being formless. It becomes something you can look at instead of something you are trapped inside. This is what good therapy does, what good art does, what good philosophy does. It helps you see your suffering as a story that has an arc, that can be told, that can be understood. And in the telling, the grip loosens. Aristotle also wrote about eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but that is not quite right. Eudaimonia is closer to flourishing or living well, not a feeling, a way of being. And he said it comes from virtue, not in the moral sense, in the sense of excellence, of functioning as you were designed to function. A knife flourishes when it cuts cleanly. A tree flourishes when it grows strong roots and broad branches. A human being flourishes when they live according to reason, courage, moderation, and justice. Suffering, then, is what happens when you live below your potential, when you betray your own values, when you know what you should do and do not do it. This is not the same as Socrates' ignorance or Plato's divided soul. This is something simpler. You know what a good friend does, and you fail to do it. You know what an honest person says, and you stay silent. You know what a courageous act requires, and you turn away. And afterward, you suffer, not because you were punished, but because you failed to be who you could have been. Aristotle believed that this kind of suffering, the suffering of moral failure, could be avoided, not through perfection, but through habit. You become virtuous the way you become a musician, through practice, through repetition, through making the right choice enough times that it becomes second nature. And once virtue becomes a habit, you stop suffering from self-betrayal, because you are finally aligned. What you value and what you do are the same thing. This is not the absence of pain. Aristotle knew life brings loss, grief, hardship, but it is the absence of regret. And regret, he believed, is the deepest and most avoidable form of suffering. Here is the thread emerging. The Buddha said, "Stop craving." Heraclitus said, "Stop resisting change." Socrates said, "Stop living in ignorance." Plato said, "Stop letting your soul be divided." Aristotle said, "Stop betraying your potential." Each answer builds on the last. Each one names a different source of suffering, and each one offers a practice. Let that land gently. We are still in the ancient world, and already the conversation has fractured into a dozen different paths, some toward acceptance, some toward understanding, some toward virtue. But there is one more ancient school we need to hear from, one that offered not transcendence, not heroism, but something quieter, a way to live with suffering that did not require eliminating it or even understanding it fully, just enduring it with grace. Chapter 7, Epicurus and the Limits of Pain. Epicurus lived in Athens around 300 BCE. He is often misunderstood. His name became associated with indulgence, excess, pleasure-seeking. But that is not what he taught. What he taught was this: most suffering is unnecessary, and unnecessary suffering can be ended by understanding what you actually need. Epicurus divided desires into three categories. First, natural and necessary desires: food when you are hungry, water when you are thirsty, shelter from the cold, friendship, peace of mind. These are non-negotiable. You cannot flourish without them. But they are also easy to satisfy. Bread and water will do. A simple roof, a few trusted friends. Second, natural but unnecessary desires: luxury food, fine wine, sexual pleasure. These are not wrong, but they are not required, and chasing them endlessly creates more suffering than satisfaction. Third, vain and empty desires: fame, wealth, power, status. These can never be satisfied. There is always someone richer, more famous, more powerful. Pursuing them guarantees suffering. Epicurus said, if you want to eliminate unnecessary suffering, stop chasing category 2 and 3 desires. Focus on category 1. And you will discover something surprising. You already have everything you need to be content. He lived this philosophy. He bought a small garden outside Athens. He invited friends to live there with him. They grew vegetables. They talked. They read. They laughed. They called it the garden. And it became one of the most famous philosophical schools in the ancient world. Not because it was grand, because it was simple. Epicurus also taught about pain. He said, pain has limits. Physical pain is either intense or chronic, but never both. If it is intense, it will not last long. Your body will either heal or you will die. Either way, the intensity ends. If it is chronic, it will not be intense. You will learn to live with it. It will fade into the background of your life. This sounds cold, but it was meant to be comforting. The mind makes pain worse by imagining it lasting forever at its current intensity. Epicurus was saying, it will not. Pain always changes. Either it lessens or you adapt. But it does not remain unbearable indefinitely. And mental suffering? That, he said, is almost entirely self-inflicted. Most of what you worry about will never happen. Most of what you regret is unchangeable. Most of what you desire is unnecessary. Strip those away, and what remains? The present moment. The meal in front of you, the friend beside you, the sky above you. Epicurus died slowly, in great pain, from kidney stones. His final letter to a friend said this: "On this blissful day as I die, I write to you. The pain in my bladder and stomach is intense, but set against this is the joy I feel remembering our conversations." He did not deny the pain, he acknowledged it, and then he placed beside it something equally real, the memory of friendship, the pleasure of having lived well. And that balance, pain on one side, joy on the other, was enough. This is what Epicurus offers at night when suffering feels overwhelming. Not the promise that it will vanish, but the reminder that it is not the only thing present. Right now, you are in pain, but you are also breathing. You are also warm. You are also safe enough to lie here and think, and that may not erase the suffering, but it makes the suffering one part of the picture instead of the whole picture. Let your body rest for just a moment. The Epicureans were not Stoics. They did not glorify endurance. They sought to minimize pain through intelligent living. But they lived in a world where pain was often unavoidable: disease, war, loss. And so another school arose, one that took Epicurus's insights and pushed them further, not toward pleasure, toward indifference, toward a kind of inner fortress that no external event could breach. This was Stoicism, and it is time to meet its founders. Chapter 8: Stoic Endurance and Inner Freedom. The Stoics began in Athens around the same time as the Epicureans. But where Epicurus withdrew to a garden, the Stoics stayed in the marketplace. They taught in public. They engaged in politics. They believed philosophy was not something to retreat into, but something to live by in the middle of chaos. The founder was Zeno of Citium, but the school grew through three great teachers: Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. Their central claim was this: you do not control what happens to you, but you do control how you respond. And your response is the only thing that determines whether you suffer. External events are indifferent, neither good nor bad. They just are. What makes them good or bad is your judgment about them. Losing money is not bad. Your belief that you need money to be happy makes it bad. Being insulted is not painful. Your belief that your reputation matters makes it painful. Even losing a loved one is not in itself suffering. Your attachment to them, your belief that you cannot be whole without them, creates the suffering. This sounds harsh, inhuman even. But the Stoics were not saying you should not love. They were saying you should love without delusion. You do not own anything. Not your health, not your wealth, not your relationships. These are on loan, and the universe can call in the loan at any moment. If you live as if you own them, you will suffer when they are taken. But if you live as if you are borrowing them, grateful for every day, aware they are temporary, then when they go, you will grieve, but you will not be destroyed. Epictetus was born into slavery. His master was cruel. One day, the master began twisting Epictetus's leg, taunting him. Epictetus said calmly, "If you keep twisting, it will break." The master kept twisting. The leg broke. And Epictetus said, "I told you it would break." He did not scream. He did not beg. He simply observed what happened and accepted it. Later, he gained his freedom and became one of the most respected philosophers in Rome. Students came from across the empire to hear him teach. And what he taught was simple. You are always free, no matter what happens to your body or your circumstances. You are free in the one place that matters, your own mind. You cannot control whether your leg breaks, but you can control whether you let the breaking define you. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He advised emperors, he wrote plays, he lived in luxury, and yet he spent his evenings writing letters to his friend Lucilius about the poverty of a busy life. "It is not that we have a short time to live," he wrote, "but that we waste a great deal of it." Most people, he said, are not living. They are preparing to live someday, when they have enough money, when they retire, when the conditions are right. But the conditions are never right, and someday never comes. Seneca died by suicide, ordered to take his own life by the Emperor Nero, his former student. He opened his veins calmly, dictating final thoughts to a scribe until he lost consciousness. He did not rage, he did not plead. He accepted what he could not change and acted with dignity in the space that remained. This is the Stoic ideal. Not that you never feel pain, but that pain does not make you undignified. That you meet suffering the way you would meet any other fact, with clear eyes and a steady hand. We will spend more time with Marcus Aurelius in the next chapter. But for now, hold this. The Stoics offered a version of freedom that does not depend on circumstances, that cannot be taken from you, that lives entirely in how you interpret events and choose to respond. It is not warm. It is not comforting in the way a friend is comforting, but it is solid, reliable. And for many people across centuries, it has been the foundation that held when everything else collapsed. Notice the shift happening. The Buddha said, "Release craving." The Stoics said, "Release attachment." It sounds the same, but it is not. The Buddha was teaching toward enlightenment, toward the end of suffering through the end of desire. The Stoics were teaching toward resilience, toward enduring suffering without being broken by it. One is about transcending the world. The other is about standing firm within it. Both are true, both are useful, and which one speaks to you may depend on where you are standing tonight. Chapter 9. Marcus Aurelius and Acceptance. Marcus Aurelius did not want to be emperor. He wanted to be a philosopher, to study, to think, to live quietly. But he was adopted by the Emperor Antoninus Pius and groomed for the throne. And when Antoninus died in 161 CE, Marcus became Emperor of Rome. For the next 19 years, he governed the largest empire on earth. He fought wars on the frontier, he managed plagues, he navigated political intrigue, and every night he wrote in his journal. Not for publication, not for history, for himself. These writings became known as the Meditations, and they are some of the most honest reflections on suffering ever recorded. He wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Meaning this: you are going to die. Maybe today, maybe in 50 years. But it is coming, and the awareness of that should change everything. Not into panic, into clarity. If you knew this was your last day, would you spend it replaying yesterday's argument? Would you waste it worrying about what someone thinks of you? No. You would be present, you would be kind, you would do what mattered, and let the rest go. Marcus believed that death awareness was not morbid, it was liberating. Because if nothing lasts, then nothing is worth clinging to with desperation, and nothing is worth avoiding with terror. He also wrote about impermanence in a way that sounds almost like the Buddha. Look at the brevity of life, how soon all things vanish. Bodies into the earth, memories into oblivion, all fame into silence. But where the Buddha sought to transcend this impermanence, Marcus sought to accept it, to love what is temporary precisely because it is temporary, to be grateful for the moment you are in, knowing it will not last, to do your duty not because it will be remembered, but because it is the right thing to do right now. He wrote to himself every morning as a kind of preparation, reminding himself that people will lie to him, betray him, misunderstand him, not as a reason to close his heart, but as a reason to manage his expectations. He could not control what others did. He could control whether he let their actions disturb his inner peace. And when they did disturb him, which they often did, he wrote himself back towards steadiness. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. He did not pretend this was easy. He struggled. He got angry. He felt overwhelmed. But he kept returning to the same discipline. Judge less, accept more, act with virtue, let go of outcomes. Marcus died on campaign, likely from plague, in 180 CE. His last words were reportedly, "Go to the rising sun, I am already setting." He did not fear death. He had been preparing for it every day of his life. This is what Marcus offers. Not a way to eliminate suffering, a way to meet it without bitterness, to see it as part of the deal you signed when you were born. You get to be alive, and in exchange, you get to suffer sometimes. You lose people, you fail, you age, you die. But none of that makes life less valuable. It makes it more valuable because it is brief and unrepeatable and entirely yours. Let your breath settle for a moment. Marcus Aurelius was the last of the great Stoics. After him, philosophy moved underground for centuries. The Roman Empire Christianized, and suffering took on a new meaning, no longer the result of misplaced attachment or poor judgment, but the result of sin, of separation from God, of a broken world waiting for redemption. This is where we enter the medieval period, and where the conversation about suffering becomes, for the first time, theological. Chapter 10, Augustine and Original Sin. Augustine was born in North Africa in 354 CE. His mother was a devout Christian. His father was a pagan. Augustine himself was neither for most of his early life. He studied rhetoric, he pursued pleasure, he joined a philosophical movement called Manichaeism that taught the world was a battleground between good and evil, light and darkness, but he was restless, searching. And in his early 30s, sitting in a garden in Milan, he heard a child's voice singing, "Take up and read." He picked up a Bible, read a passage from Paul's letters, and something broke open in him. He converted to Christianity, became a priest, then a bishop, and spent the rest of his life writing about the human condition. His central text on suffering is called The City of God, written after Rome was sacked in 410 CE, when the Christian world was asking, why did God allow this? Augustine's answer: because humanity chose it. Not consciously, not intentionally, but through original sin. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were offered a choice: obey God and live in harmony, or disobey and know good and evil. They chose knowledge. They ate the fruit. And that choice severed humanity from God. Augustine believed that every human being born after that moment inherits the consequences. Not the guilt, but the condition. We are born into a world where suffering is inevitable, where bodies decay, where relationships fracture, where even our best intentions produce harm. This is not punishment. It is reality. The reality of being separated from the source of all goodness. And the only way out, Augustine taught, is grace. Not earned, not achieved through virtue or wisdom, given freely by a God who chooses to restore what was broken. For Augustine, suffering is both cosmic and personal. Cosmic because it is woven into the structure of a fallen world. You did not cause it, but you live in it. Personal because your choices matter. You can deepen your separation from God through selfishness, cruelty, pride. Or you can turn toward God and begin the slow work of healing. He wrote about this in his Confessions, one of the first autobiographies in Western literature. He described his youth, his mistakes, his arrogance, and then his conversion. The moment he stopped running and let himself be found, and what he found was not answers, but acceptance. Not elimination of suffering, but the belief that suffering could be redemptive. That pain, when offered up to God, could become a kind of purification, a burning away of selfishness, a deepening of compassion. Augustine did not glorify suffering. but he refused to call it meaningless. He believed that every moment of pain held the potential for transformation. If you let it soften you instead of hardening you, if you let it turn you toward others instead of away from them, this is a radical shift from the Stoics. For the Stoics, suffering was indifferent, neither good nor bad. What mattered was your response. For Augustine, suffering was significant. It pointed toward something larger, a broken world yearning for repair, a soul searching for its source. He did not promise that faith would eliminate pain. He promised that faith would give pain a meaning it could not have on its own. And for many centuries, that meaning was enough. Let your shoulders drop. Augustine's theology became the foundation of medieval Christian thought, and it shaped how millions of people understood their suffering. Not as random, not as punishment, but as part of a story larger than themselves. A story with a beginning, a fall, and, eventually, a restoration. But within that framework, questions remained, hard questions, questions that philosophers and theologians would wrestle with for the next 1,000 years. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does he allow suffering at all? Why not prevent it? Why not intervene? This question has a name, and it is one of the most important questions in the history of philosophy. Chapter 11, Aquinas, on evil and privation. Thomas Aquinas was born in Italy in 1225. He joined the Dominican order against his family's wishes. They wanted him to become a powerful abbot. He wanted to study and teach. He spent his life reconciling Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy, trying to show that faith and reason were not enemies but partners. And one of the central problems he tackled was this: what is evil, and why does it exist? Aquinas' answer: evil is not a thing. It is the absence of a thing. He called it privation, a lack, the way darkness is the absence of light, or cold is the absence of heat. Evil, he said, is the absence of goodness that should be there. A blind eye is evil, not because blindness is a substance, but because sight should be present and is not. A cruel act is evil not because cruelty is a force, but because compassion should be present and is not. This might seem like a semantic trick, but it has profound implications for suffering. If evil is not a substance, not a thing God created, then God is not responsible for it. Evil is not part of the design, it is a corruption of the design. Suffering enters the world not because God wills it, but because creation is incomplete, finite, capable of malfunctioning. And human beings with free will are capable of choosing actions that increase the absence of goodness. You can choose to lie when you should tell the truth, to harm when you should heal, to abandon when you should stay. And each choice creates a privation, a hole where goodness should be, and that hole reverberates outward, causing suffering in others. Aquinas believed that God permits evil for a greater good, not because God wants suffering, but because eliminating all suffering would require eliminating free will. And free will is a greater good than the absence of pain. Think of it this way. Imagine a world where you could not choose wrongly, where every decision was predetermined to be good, where no one could lie, betray, harm, or neglect. It sounds peaceful, but it would not be human. You would be a puppet, a program, not a person. The capacity to suffer is the price of the capacity to choose. And the capacity to choose is what makes love real, courage real, sacrifice real. Aquinas did not pretend this made suffering easy, but he believed it made suffering coherent. It fit into a framework, a world created good, corrupted by free will, capable of being redeemed through grace. He also wrote about the hierarchy of suffering. Not all suffering is equal. Physical pain is less than emotional pain. Emotional pain is less than spiritual pain. The deepest suffering, he taught, is separation from God, the sense that you are alone, that the universe does not care, that your existence is arbitrary. And the deepest healing comes from reconnection, from the experience, however brief, that you are held, that your life has purpose, that you are part of something larger than yourself. Aquinas died on his way to a church council in 1274. His last words were about the Eucharist, about the presence of God in ordinary bread and wine. He spent his life building intellectual systems, but at the end he said those systems were like straw compared to the direct experience of the divine. This is the tension at the heart of medieval philosophy. You can explain suffering, you can fit it into categories, you can build arguments about why it exists and what it means. But in the end, the person in pain does not need an argument. They need presence. They need to feel less alone. And that, Aquinas knew, was beyond philosophy. It was the territory of faith. Let that rest for a moment. We have moved from the Stoics, who said suffering is indifferent, to the Christians, who said suffering is significant. From Marcus Aurelius, who said accept it, to Augustine, who said God will redeem it. From philosophers who sought wisdom to theologians who sought salvation. And yet, the question persists. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does he permit suffering at all? This question has a formal name, and it has haunted religious thought for centuries. Chapter 12, The Problem of Theodicy. The problem of theodicy is simple to state. If God is all-powerful, he could prevent suffering. If God is all-good, he would want to prevent suffering. Yet, suffering exists. Therefore, either God is not all-powerful, or God is not all-good, or God does not exist. This argument has been used by skeptics for centuries to challenge religious belief, and theologians have spent centuries trying to answer it. Leibniz, the philosopher who coined the term theodicy, argued that this is the best of all possible worlds, not perfect, not without suffering, but the best that could exist given the constraints of logic and free will. A world without suffering would require removing free will, which would remove the possibility of genuine love, courage, and moral growth. So God permits suffering because the alternative, a world of automatons, would be worse. This answer satisfies some people. It enrages others, because it asks the person in pain to accept that their suffering is justified by some greater cosmic calculus, that their loss was necessary, that their agony serves a purpose they may never understand. And for many, that is not comfort. It is cruelty. Other theologians took a different approach. They said God suffers with us. In Christianity, God becomes human in the person of Jesus. And Jesus suffers. He is betrayed, tortured, killed. Why? To show that God does not stand apart from suffering, he enters into it. This does not eliminate the problem of evil, but it reframes it. God is not indifferent to your pain. He shares it, and in sharing it, he transforms it into something redemptive. But even this answer leaves questions. If God suffers with us, why not simply end the suffering? If he has the power to intervene, why does he so often seem absent? The Jewish response to this question has been different. After the Holocaust, some Jewish theologians said, God is silent, and we must live with that silence. Not because God does not exist, but because God has chosen to limit his own power, to make room for human freedom. And that freedom comes with the possibility of unspeakable evil. God does not intervene because intervention would undo the gift of freedom, and without freedom there is no covenant, no relationship, no meaning. This is not an answer. It is a way of living with the question. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. In it, he argued that God is not all-powerful. God is all good. But he cannot control everything. Suffering happens because the universe has its own laws. Accidents happen, cells mutate, people make choices, and God grieves with us but cannot always prevent the pain. This makes God smaller, but it makes God present. And for many people, presence is more comforting than power. Here is what the problem of theodicy teaches. Every answer to suffering is also an answer to what you believe about the universe. If you believe the universe is indifferent, suffering is random. You endure it and move on. If you believe the universe is meaningful, suffering must have a purpose. You search for it. If you believe the universe is broken, suffering is a sign that something went wrong. You work to fix it. None of these answers is provable. All of them are livable. And which one you choose shapes not just your philosophy, but your life. Let your breath slow for a moment. We have spent 10 chapters in the ancient and medieval worlds, and what we have found is not a single answer to suffering, but a constellation of answers. Some say accept it, some say endure it, some say redeem it, some say God shares it, some say God permits it. And now we move forward into the modern era, where the conversation fractures even further, where Descartes splits mind from body, where Spinoza denies free will entirely, where Pascal stares into the void and finds only terror. The question does not change, but the answers become stranger and somehow more honest. Chapter 13, Descartes and the Mind-Body Divide. René Descartes was born in France in 1596. He is often called the father of modern philosophy, not because he answered every question, but because he asked them in a new way. He wanted certainty, absolute certainty. And so he decided to doubt everything until he found something he could not doubt. He doubted his senses. Illusions prove they can deceive. He doubted other people. They could be lying. He doubted the world itself. It could be a dream. But then he arrived at one thing he could not doubt. I think, therefore I am. Even if everything else is an illusion, the fact that I am doubting proves I exist. Because to doubt, there must be a doubter. This became the foundation of his philosophy. The mind is primary. The thinking self is the only thing you can be certain of. And from that foundation, he built a system. But the system contained a problem that would haunt philosophy for centuries. Descartes said the mind and body are two separate substances. The mind is immaterial. It thinks, it doubts, it wills. The body is material. It moves, it decays, it feels pain. But if they are separate, how do they interact? How does the decision to raise your arm cause your arm to rise? How does a physical injury cause mental suffering? Descartes never solved this problem. He suggested the pineal gland in the brain was the point of contact, but that was speculation, not proof. And the question remains, if the mind and body are distinct, why does suffering cross the boundary so easily? Why does physical pain create emotional distress? Why does grief create physical exhaustion? Why does anxiety show up as a racing heart, tight shoulders, shallow breath? The mind-body divide is useful for some things. It allows you to study the brain as a machine, to understand neurons, chemicals, circuits. But it is disastrous for suffering, because it suggests that pain in the body is separate from pain in the mind, and that separation creates a hierarchy. Physical pain is real. Emotional pain is in your head. But anyone who has lived knows that is not true. The pain of loss can be as sharp as the pain of a broken bone. The exhaustion of depression can be as disabling as the exhaustion of disease. Descartes' split created a problem that medicine and psychology are still trying to solve. How do you treat a person who is not two separate things, mind and body, but one integrated system? But Descartes did offer one insight that matters for suffering. If the mind is primary, then the way you think about pain changes the pain itself. You can have the same injury and experience it differently depending on what story you tell about it. If you believe the pain is permanent, it becomes unbearable. If you believe it is temporary, you endure it. If you believe the pain is meaningless, it feels like cruelty. If you believe the pain is transformative, it feels like a trial you can survive. The mind does not create the pain, but it shapes how the pain is held. And that shaping, that interpretive layer, is where philosophy becomes practical again. Because you may not control the injury, but you do control the story you tell about the injury. And that story is not nothing. It is the difference between suffering and despair. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Descartes split the world in two: mind and matter, thought and extension, self and world. But another philosopher, living at the same time, refused that split entirely. He said, there is only one substance, one reality, and everything, including your suffering, is part of it. His name was Spinoza, and his vision is one of the strangest and most comforting in all of philosophy. Chapter 14, Spinoza and Necessary Nature. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 to a family of Portuguese Jews. He was brilliant. By his early 20s, he was questioning traditional religious teachings, and for that he was excommunicated from the Jewish community. He spent the rest of his life grinding lenses for a living and writing philosophy in solitude. His masterwork, The Ethics, was not published until after his death, and when it was, it shocked Europe, because Spinoza said something almost no one was willing to say. God and nature are the same thing. Not that God created nature, that God is nature. Every rock, every tree, every thought, every atom, all of it is God expressing itself in infinite forms. This is called pantheism, and it changes everything about suffering. If God is nature, then nothing happens outside of God's will. There is no free will, no chance, no randomness. Everything that happens necessarily. It could not have happened any other way. Your birth, your choices, your losses, your suffering, all of it was determined by the infinite chain of causes stretching back to the beginning of time. This sounds horrifying at first. It sounds like fatalism, like giving up. But Spinoza saw it differently. He said the cause of suffering is confusion. We think we are separate. We think we have free will. We think we could have done otherwise. And that belief creates regret, guilt, resentment, and fear. But if you understand that everything is necessary, those emotions lose their grip. You stop regretting the past, because it could not have been different. You stop fearing the future, because it is already unfolding according to the laws of nature. You stop blaming others, because they too are acting necessarily. And in that understanding, Spinoza said, you find freedom, not the freedom to choose, the freedom from the illusion of choice. You are part of an infinite, intelligent, necessary system, and understanding that system, seeing how it works, is the highest form of joy. Spinoza called this understanding the intellectual love of God. It is not worship, it is clarity, the clarity of seeing your place in the whole and accepting it. not with resignation, with peace. Think of it this way. Imagine you are a wave in the ocean. You rise, you crest, you crash against the shore, and then you dissolve back into the water. If you think you are separate from the ocean, the crash is terrifying. It feels like death. But if you understand that you are the ocean, temporarily taking the form of a wave, then the crash is not death, it is transformation. You do not disappear, you return. Spinoza believed that the suffering caused by loss comes from identifying with the temporary form instead of the eternal substance. You are not the wave. You are the ocean, and the ocean does not die. This is not a metaphor for Spinoza. It is literal. You are not your body or your thoughts. You are a mode of God, an expression of the infinite. And when your body dies, the substance continues. Not as an individual self, but as the energy, the matter, the pattern that reassembles into something else. Spinoza died at 44, probably from lung disease caused by inhaling glass dust from lens grinding. His last visitor found him calm. He did not fear death. He had spent his life understanding it. And for him, death was not an ending, it was a return. Here is what Spinoza offers. Not comfort in the conventional sense, but a radical reframing. If everything is necessary, then nothing is wrong. It just is. And when you stop arguing with what is, when you stop insisting it should have been different, the suffering loses its sting. Not because the pain goes away, but because the resistance to the pain goes away. And resistance, Spinoza believed, is the only real source of suffering. Let that settle for a moment. We have moved from Descartes, who split mind and body, to Spinoza, who reunited everything into one necessary whole. And now we turn to a third voice. A man who lived in the same century and saw the same cosmos, but arrived at very different conclusions. He did not find peace in necessity. He found terror. Chapter 15, Pascal and Existential Anxiety. Blaise Pascal was born in France in 1623. He was a prodigy. By his teens, he had invented a calculating machine. By his 20s, he was contributing to mathematics and physics. He seemed destined for greatness. And then he had a religious experience, a vision. He described it as fire, and afterward everything changed. He abandoned science. He devoted himself to defending Christianity against skeptics. And he wrote a series of notes, fragments really, that were never finished before his death at 39. These notes became the Pensées, and they contain some of the most haunting reflections on suffering ever written. Pascal saw clearly what Spinoza saw, that the universe is vast, indifferent, governed by laws that do not care about human meaning. But where Spinoza found peace in that vision, Pascal found horror. He wrote, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me." Think about that line. The universe is silent. It does not speak. It does not answer. It does not care. You call out, and the echo is your own voice. Pascal believed that human beings cannot bear this silence. We need meaning, we need purpose, we need to believe we matter, and so we distract ourselves constantly. He called it diversion. We fill our time with work, entertainment, ambition, relationships, anything to avoid sitting alone in a room with the silence. He wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly alone in a room." This line has been quoted for centuries, and it is both true and unbearable, because sitting alone in a room means facing the silence, the emptiness, the fact that there is no guarantee your life means anything. Pascal's answer was faith, not as a solution, as a wager. He argued, you do not know if God exists, but you must choose. If God exists and you believe, you gain everything. If God exists and you do not believe, you lose everything. If God does not exist, the stakes are much lower. Either way, you live your life and die. So the rational choice is to believe, because the potential gain outweighs the potential loss. This argument has been criticized endlessly. You cannot choose to believe just because the math says you should. Belief does not work that way. But Pascal knew that. He was not really making a logical argument. He was describing a desperate hope. Hope that the silence is not the final answer, that there is something beyond the infinite spaces, that suffering is not meaningless. Pascal's vision of suffering is existential. It is the suffering of being conscious in a universe that does not care, of knowing you will die, of searching for meaning and finding only echoes. This is not physical pain. It is not even emotional pain. It is metaphysical pain, the pain of existence itself. And Pascal believed that this pain, this anxiety, is hardwired into human beings. We cannot escape it. We can only choose how we respond. Distract ourselves, numb ourselves, or turn toward faith and hope for something beyond the silence. Pascal did not live to finish his defense of Christianity. His health failed. He died in pain, murmuring about God and geometry. But his fragments remain. And they speak to anyone who has ever lain awake at 3 a.m. and felt the weight of the universe pressing down. Not the weight of specific problems, the weight of existence itself, the sense that you are a tiny spark in an infinite darkness, and the darkness is indifferent. Let your breath slow for a moment. Pascal saw what Spinoza saw, but he reacted differently. Spinoza said, "Accept the silence, understand it, find peace in it." Pascal said, "I cannot. The silence terrifies me, and I need to believe there is something more." Both are honest, both are understandable, and both are still options tonight. You can seek peace in acceptance, or you can seek comfort in faith, or you can live in the tension between them. But the anxiety Pascal named, the existential dread of being conscious in an indifferent universe, is real. And it does not go away just because you understand it. We are moving now into the modern period, and the conversation becomes darker, more personal, more psychological. The philosophers we meet next are no longer asking what suffering is. They are asking how to live with it, how to find meaning in it, how to become stronger through it. And the first voice in that conversation is one of the most influential in all of Western thought. Chapter 16, Kant and Moral Struggle. Immanuel Kant lived in Königsberg, Prussia, and rarely left the city. He was a creature of routine. He walked the same path every day at the same time. Neighbors set their clocks by him, and yet his mind traveled further than most people who cross continents. He wrote The Critique of Pure Reason, one of the densest and most important books in philosophy. And he argued for something radical. Morality is not about happiness, it is about duty. You do not do the right thing because it makes you feel good. You do it because it is right, regardless of the consequences, regardless of how it makes you feel. Kant believed that suffering often comes from acting immorally, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of internal conflict. When you lie, you create dissonance. Part of you knows the truth, part of you is hiding it, and that split creates suffering. When you betray a friend, you lose trust in yourself. Because if you can betray them, you can betray anyone, including yourself. Kant said the only way to avoid this suffering is to act according to the categorical imperative. Act only according to the maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it become a universal law. Meaning, before you act, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? Would the world still function? Would trust still exist? Would relationships still be possible? If the answer is no, do not do it. This sounds rigid, cold, but Kant was not interested in making life easy. He was interested in making life coherent. He believed that humans have two natures. We are animals and we are rational beings. As animals, we seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is natural, but it is not moral. As rational beings, we are capable of recognizing what is right and doing it even when it is hard, even when it hurts. And moral struggle, the tension between what you want and what you ought to do, is not a flaw. It is the essence of being human. Kant wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." The starry heavens show the vastness of the universe. The moral law shows the dignity of the individual. You are small, but you are not nothing, because you are capable of choosing what is right over what is easy. And that capacity, Kant believed, is sacred. Suffering, for Kant, is the price of freedom. If you were not free to choose, you could not suffer from regret. You could not feel the weight of responsibility. But you are free, and that freedom comes with the burden of choice and the consequences of those choices. Kant did not offer comfort. He offered structure. He said, "You will suffer. But if you suffer while acting according to your principles, you will retain your dignity. And dignity is worth more than comfort." This is not gentle, but it is solid. And for people who feel like their life is falling apart, sometimes solidity is the most important thing. Let your body rest for a moment. Kant's philosophy is about self-governance, about mastering yourself, about becoming someone you can respect. But another philosopher, living in Germany a generation later, had a very different vision. He said suffering was not just the cost of freedom, it was the engine of history itself. Chapter 17. Hegel and the Labor of Spirit. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is one of the most difficult philosophers to read. His sentences are long, his terms are abstract, and his system is so vast and interconnected that pulling out one piece distorts the whole. But at the heart of his philosophy is one simple claim. History is the story of consciousness learning to know itself, and suffering is how consciousness learns. Hegel believed that reality is not static, it is a process, a becoming, and that process moves through conflict. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. An idea arises. It is challenged. The conflict produces something new that contains both the original idea and its opposite. This is not just abstract. It is how life works. You have a belief about yourself. Life challenges it. You suffer. And through the suffering, a more complex understanding emerges. You believe you are strong. You fail. The failure teaches you that strength includes vulnerability, and the synthesis is a deeper, more honest version of strength. Hegel called this process the labor of spirit. Spirit, which you can think of as consciousness, or God, or reality itself, is working through history. And it works through individuals. You are not separate from this process. You are part of it. Your suffering is part of how spirit comes to know itself. This sounds insane, and maybe it is, but it also reframes suffering in a way that is strangely empowering. You are not suffering pointlessly. You are suffering because you are part of a vast, intelligent process that is trying to understand itself. And every time you move through suffering and come out changed, you contribute to that understanding. Hegel believed that freedom is not the absence of struggle. It is the recognition that you are both the subject and the object of history. You are being shaped, and you are shaping, you are suffering, and you are learning, and the learning is not optional. It is the only way consciousness evolves. Think of it this way. A child believes their parents are perfect. Then they grow up and see their parents' flaws. This creates suffering, disillusionment, anger. But through that suffering, a new understanding emerges. The parents are human, imperfect, and the child learns compassion. That is the labor of spirit, moving from naive unity through painful separation toward mature integration. Hegel died in 1831 during a cholera epidemic. His last words were reportedly, "Only one man understood me, and he misunderstood me." He was joking, but the joke reveals something true. His system was so complex that almost no one grasped the whole. But the core insight remains: suffering is not waste, it is work. The work of becoming more conscious, more integrated, more whole. Here is what Hegel offers: not comfort, but context. Your pain is not random. It is part of a larger pattern, a historical process, a movement towards something. What that something is, Hegel was never entirely clear about. Freedom, self-knowledge, the reconciliation of all contradictions. But the promise is this: the suffering is not the end, it is the labor. And labor produces something. Let that rest gently. We have moved from Kant's moral struggle to Hegel's historical process. And now we turn to a philosopher who took Hegel's vision and inverted it. He said suffering is not the labor of spirit, it is the tyranny of will, blind, insatiable, indifferent to your happiness. And the only escape is to stop wanting entirely. Chapter 18. Schopenhauer and Blind Will. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 inches Danzig. He was wealthy, educated, brilliant, and miserable. He wrote his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, at age 30. He believed it would change philosophy. It did not. Almost no one read it. He spent the next 40 years revising it, promoting it, and writing essays attacking other philosophers who ignored him. He died in 1860. Bitter, but finally famous. The world had caught up to his pessimism. Schopenhauer's central claim is this: the world is not rational. It is driven by a blind, insatiable force he called the will. The will is not your personal will. It is the force that drives all existence. The urge to survive, to reproduce, to consume, to dominate. Every plant reaching toward the sun. Every animal hunting for food. Every human striving for success, love, pleasure, recognition. All of it is the will using us to perpetuate itself. And the will is never satisfied, because satisfaction would mean the end of striving. And the will is nothing but striving. This is why you are never happy for long. You achieve a goal, you feel pleasure, and then the pleasure fades, and you want something else. You get the promotion, you want a bigger one, you find love, you worry about losing it, you acquire wealth, you want more. The treadmill never stops, because the will never stops. Schopenhauer believed that suffering is not an accident, it is the essence of life, because life is desire, and desire is suffering. When you do not get what you want, you suffer. When you get what you want, you stop wanting it. And then you suffer from boredom. The only escape, he said, is to deny the will, to stop wanting, to withdraw from the world, to become ascetic. This is why he admired Buddhism and Hinduism. They understood what the West had forgotten, that life is suffering and the only way out is renunciation. Schopenhauer also offered two temporary reprieves from suffering: art and compassion. Art, he said, allows you to step outside the will momentarily. When you contemplate beauty, a painting, a symphony, a landscape, you forget yourself. You stop wanting. You simply observe. And in that moment, the suffering stops. But it is temporary. Eventually, you return to yourself, and the will resumes its tyranny. Compassion works differently. When you see another person suffering and feel their pain as your own, you recognize something profound. We are not separate. We are all expressions of the same will. And if we are the same, then harming another is harming yourself. Helping another is helping yourself. This is the foundation of ethics. For Schopenhauer, not duty, not reason, compassion, the recognition of shared suffering. Schopenhauer's vision is bleak. There is no redemption, no progress, no hope that life will get better. The will is eternal, blind and indifferent. But there is a strange consolation in this bleakness. It tells you the truth. Life is hard, and it was always going to be hard. Not because you failed, not because you are broken, but because this is the nature of existence. And once you accept that, you stop blaming yourself. You stop believing that if you just tried harder, everything would be fine. You see that the game is rigged, and you stop expecting to win. This is not happiness, but it is a kind of peace. The peace of no longer fighting what cannot be changed. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Schopenhauer was a pessimist, but he was an honest pessimist. And for many people, his honesty is more comforting than false hope. But his student, or at least the philosopher who was most influenced by him, took his pessimism and transformed it into something else. Not acceptance, not renunciation, but affirmation. The willingness to say yes to life, even to suffering, especially to suffering. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and his answer to suffering is one of the strangest and most powerful in all of philosophy. Chapter 19, Kierkegaard and Despair. Before we meet Nietzsche, we need to pause, because there is another voice, quieter, more personal, more Christian, that changes the conversation about suffering. Søren Kierkegaard lived in Copenhagen in the early 1800s. He was brilliant, melancholic, deeply religious, and he spent his life writing about one thing: what it means to exist, not to think, not to observe, but to exist, to be a self, to stand before God, to make choices with no certainty about whether they are right. Kierkegaard believed that suffering is not primarily about pain, it is about despair. And despair comes in three forms. The first is the despair of not knowing you are a self. You live unconsciously. You follow the crowd. You do what is expected. You never ask who you are or what you want. This is the most common form of despair, and most people never recognize it. They think they are fine, but they are not living. They are being lived. The second is the despair of not wanting to be yourself. You know who you are, and you hate it. You wish you were someone else, someone stronger, smarter, more successful. This despair is conscious, and it is painful, because you are aware that you are failing to live up to your own expectations. The third is the despair of wanting to be yourself but failing. You know who you are. You want to be that person, but life will not let you. You have responsibilities, obligations, failures, and the gap between who you are and who you want to be is unbearable. Kierkegaard believed that all three forms of despair are sickness, a sickness of the spirit. And the cure is not happiness, it is faith, not intellectual belief, but the leap of faith, the willingness to stand before God in all your brokenness and say, I do not understand, but I trust. This is not easy. Kierkegaard called it fear and trembling, the terror of surrendering control, of admitting you do not have the answers, of letting yourself be held by something larger than yourself. He wrote about Abraham. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham did not understand, but he obeyed. And at the last moment, God stopped him. Kierkegaard said, this story is the essence of faith. Obedience without understanding. Trust without proof. Most people find this horrifying, and maybe it is. But Kierkegaard believed it was the only honest response to existence. You do not know why you suffer. You do not know if it has a purpose. You do not know if God is listening. But you can choose to believe anyway. Not because it is rational, but because the alternative, despair, is unbearable. Kierkegaard spent his life walking the streets of Copenhagen alone, thinking, writing, struggling. He was engaged once. He broke it off because he believed he could not be both a husband and the person God called him to be. He died at 42, alone, exhausted, but certain that his suffering had meaning, even if he could not see it. Here is what Kierkegaard offers: not an explanation, but a posture, the willingness to stand in the anxiety of existence and not run from it. Not to numb it, not to distract yourself, but to face it, and to choose, despite the terror, to believe that you are held. This is not philosophy as theory. This is philosophy as practice, as a way of being in the world when the world makes no sense. And for many people, it is the only thing that keeps them standing. Let your breath slow. We have heard from Schopenhauer, who said life is suffering and the only escape is renunciation. We have heard from Kierkegaard, who said life is despair and the only escape is faith. And now we turn to Nietzsche, who said there is no escape and you should not want one. Chapter 20. Nietzsche and Amor Fati. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 inches, Prussia. He was brilliant, fragile, and plagued by illness for most of his life. Chronic migraines, digestive problems, poor eyesight. He spent years in agony, and yet he wrote some of the most life-affirming philosophy in history. Nietzsche read Schopenhauer as a young man and was captivated. The world is suffering, the will is blind, life is pain. But then he asked, what if we said yes to it anyway? Not despite the suffering, because of it. What if suffering is not a flaw in existence, but the condition of everything valuable? Without struggle, there is no growth. Without loss, there is no love. Without pain, there is no meaning. Nietzsche called this amor fati, love of fate. Not acceptance, not resignation, love. He wrote, my formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Think about that. Not just accepting what happened, wanting it to have happened, being grateful for it, even the worst of it, because the worst of it made you who you are. And who you are is the only thing you have. This sounds insane. How can you love the suffering? How can you want the loss? But Nietzsche was not asking you to lie to yourself. He was asking you to see the whole picture. You are not just the person who suffered. You are also the person who survived it, who learned from it, who became stronger, wiser, more compassionate because of it. And if you erase the suffering, you erase that person. So the choice is not between suffering and no suffering. The choice is between saying yes to your life as it actually is, or wishing you had lived someone else's life. Nietzsche believed that most people spend their lives wishing they were someone else, and that wish is the real suffering. He wrote about the eternal recurrence. Imagine that you had to live your life over and over again. Every moment, every joy, every pain, forever. Would you say yes? Most people would say no, because they regret too much. They wish too much had been different. But Nietzsche said, if you can say yes, if you can look at your life and say, I would do it all again exactly as it was, then you are free. Because you are no longer wishing for a different life. You are living this one fully, without reservation. Nietzsche also wrote about what he called the revaluation of all values. He said Christianity and other moral systems teach you to hate suffering, to see it as punishment, to believe that the virtuous life is the comfortable life. But this is a lie, and it makes you weak. Strength comes from struggle. Greatness comes from overcoming obstacles. Meaning comes from suffering transformed into purpose. So instead of avoiding pain, seek it. Not masochistically, but as the price of becoming who you are capable of being. He wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Not always true. Sometimes suffering just breaks you. Nietzsche knew that. He suffered deeply, and in the end, he broke. He collapsed on a street in Turin, Italy, in 1889, possibly after seeing a horse being beaten. He never recovered his sanity. He spent the last 11 years of his life in the care of his mother and sister. But before that collapse, he wrote with a ferocity and clarity that almost no one has matched. He said, "Do not wait for life to get easier. Do not wait for a savior. Do not wait for heaven. Say yes to this life, this body, this suffering, this joy, all of it, now, because this is all there is. And it is enough. Let that settle for a moment." Nietzsche's vision is not for everyone. It is hard, demanding, and it offers no comfort beyond the affirmation of your own existence. But for some people, it is exactly what they need. Not to be told that suffering will end, but to be told that suffering has meaning, and that they are strong enough to bear it. We have moved through 2,000 years. From the Buddha to Nietzsche, from renunciation to affirmation. And now we enter the modern age, where suffering is no longer just philosophical, it is psychological, political, social. And the thinkers we meet next are not asking how to transcend suffering, they are asking how to live in a world that produces suffering systematically. Chapter 21, Marx and Alienation. Karl Marx was born in Germany in 1818. He studied philosophy, but he became frustrated with it. He famously wrote, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it." For Marx, suffering was not primarily metaphysical or existential, it was economic. People suffer because they are exploited, because they work for wages that do not reflect the value they create, because they are alienated from their labor, their products, and each other. Marx used the word alienation to describe 4 separations. First, alienation from the product of your work. You build something, but it belongs to someone else. You pour your time and energy into it, and then it is taken from you. Second, alienation from the process of your work. You do not choose what to make or how to make it. You follow orders, you repeat the same motions, your creativity is irrelevant. Third, alienation from your own humanity. Work should be fulfilling. It should express who you are. But under capitalism, it is just survival. You sell your time, and in doing so, you sell yourself. Fourth, alienation from other people. You are in competition for jobs, for wages, for status. The person beside you is not your comrade, they are your rival. Marx believed that this alienation is the source of most modern suffering. Not all suffering, but the suffering that is specific to capitalism, the exhaustion, the meaninglessness, the sense that your life is not your own. And his solution was not individual, It was collective revolution, the overthrow of the capitalist system, the creation of a society where workers own the means of production and no one is exploited. Whether that solution works is a different question. History has shown that attempts to implement it have often led to new forms of suffering. But Marx's diagnosis remains useful. He saw clearly that suffering is not always about your personal psychology. Sometimes it is about the structures you live within. You can be anxious because of a chemical imbalance, or because you are working 3 jobs and cannot pay rent. You can be depressed because of trauma, or because your life has no meaning beyond producing profit for someone else. Marx said, "Do not just fix yourself, fix the system." Here is what Marx offers. Not an individual answer, but a social one. The recognition that your suffering may not be your fault, that it may be the result of conditions imposed on you, and that those conditions can change. This is not comfort, but it is solidarity, the knowledge that you are not alone in your suffering, and that together you might build something better. Let your body rest for a moment. Marx's vision was political, but around the same time, another thinker was developing a very different vision, not about economics, about the mind, about the hidden forces that drive behavior, about the conflicts buried beneath consciousness. His name was Sigmund Freud, and his work would redefine how we think about suffering. Chapter 22, Freud and the Unconscious Conflict. Sigmund Freud was born in Austria in 1856. He trained as a neurologist, but he became fascinated by something else: patients whose physical symptoms had no physical cause. Paralysis without nerve damage, blindness without eye disease, pain without injury. He called these symptoms hysteria, and he believed they were caused not by the body, but by the mind, specifically by the unconscious. Freud's central insight was this: most of your mental life is hidden from you. You think you know why you do what you do, but you do not. Your conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it is the unconscious, a vast reservoir of memories, desires, fears, and conflicts that shape your behavior without your awareness. And suffering, for Freud, comes from conflict between the unconscious and the conscious. You want something you are not allowed to want. You feel something you are not allowed to feel. And so you repress it, push it down, bury it. But it does not disappear. It transforms into anxiety, into physical symptoms, into compulsive behaviors, into dreams. Freud believed that the unconscious speaks through symptoms, and the job of psychoanalysis is to listen, to decode the symptoms, to bring the unconscious conflict into consciousness. And once it is conscious, it loses its power. He divided the mind into 3 parts. The id, the primitive, instinctual part that wants pleasure and avoids pain. It operates on the pleasure principle. It does not care about consequences. The ego, the rational part that navigates reality. It operates on the reality principle. It mediates between the id's demands and the world's constraints. Then, the superego, the moral part that judges you. It internalizes the rules of society. It tells you what you should and should not do. Suffering happens when these three parts are at war. The id wants something. The superego says it is wrong. The ego is caught in the middle, trying to satisfy both, and the tension creates anxiety. For example, you are angry at someone you love. The id wants to rage. The superego says you must be kind. The ego represses the rage, and the rage turns into guilt or depression or a migraine. Freud believed that most people are not aware of these conflicts. They just feel the symptoms, and the symptoms keep them stuck. Freud also wrote about the death drive, thanatos, the unconscious pull toward destruction, dissolution, return to nothingness. He believed that humans are not just driven by the desire for life and pleasure, they are also driven by the desire to escape, to stop, to end the tension of existence. This is why people repeat self-destructive patterns, why they sabotage relationships, why they harm themselves. Not because they are broken, but because part of them wants to stop fighting. Freud did not offer easy solutions. Psychoanalysis is long, difficult, and it does not promise happiness. It promises insight, the ability to see your own patterns, to understand why you suffer, and to choose differently. But insight is not always enough. Sometimes the patterns are too deep, too ingrained, and the suffering continues. Freud died in 1939 inches London, having fled the Nazis. He had cancer of the jaw. He endured it for years. And when the pain became unbearable, he asked his doctor to help him die. He faced death the way he faced everything, with clarity, without illusion. Here is what Freud offers. Not a cure, but a map, a way of understanding your suffering as a message from the parts of yourself you have been ignoring. And once you start listening, the suffering may not end, but it changes. It becomes something you can work with, instead of something that works against you. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Freud's student, Carl Jung, took these ideas and expanded them. He believed the unconscious was not just personal, it was collective, and suffering was not just about repressed desires, it was about unintegrated parts of the self. We met Jung earlier, but now we return to him with more depth because his vision of suffering is one of the most influential in modern psychology. Chapter 23, Jung and the Shadow. Carl Jung was Freud's protege. For years they were close. Freud even called Jung his crown prince. But they split in 1913. Freud believed the unconscious was driven by repressed sexuality. Jung believed it was driven by something larger. Archetypes, universal patterns, a collective unconscious shared by all humanity. And one of the most important archetypes Jung identified was the shadow. The shadow is everything you refuse to accept about yourself. The parts of you that are selfish, cruel, petty, weak, cowardly, lustful, jealous. You do not see these parts. You project them onto others. You see in them the qualities you deny in yourself. And that projection creates suffering, because you are not dealing with reality. You are dealing with your own disowned darkness reflected back at you. Jung believed that the path to wholeness requires integrating the shadow, not eliminating it, integrating it. You do not become less cruel. You become aware that you are capable of cruelty. And in that awareness, you gain control. You do not become less selfish. You admit that you have needs, and in admitting them, you stop manipulating to get them met. The shadow is not evil, it is unconscious. And it is the unconscious that is dangerous. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Suffering, for Jung, is often the result of refusing to look at your own darkness. You build an identity around being good, kind, moral, and then you wonder why you feel empty, why you feel like you are performing, because you are. You are performing the persona, the mask you wear for the world. And beneath the mask is the shadow, the real you, the messy, contradictory, human you. Jung also wrote about individuation, the process of becoming yourself, not who your parents wanted you to be, not who society expects, not who your ego thinks you should be, but who you actually are. All of it. Light and shadow, strength and weakness, conscious and unconscious. This process is not comfortable. It requires facing things you have avoided for decades. It requires grief, shame, anger, fear. But Jung believed it was the only path to a life that feels real. Most people, he said, live the unlived life, the life they were supposed to live, the safe life, the approved life. And they suffer not because life is hard, but because they are not living their own life. They are living someone else's version of who they should be. Jung suffered a nervous breakdown after his split with Freud. He withdrew from public life. He stopped seeing patients. He spent years in what he called confrontation with the unconscious. He heard voices. He saw visions. He wrote them down in a journal that became known as the Red Book. For decades, he showed it to no one. He believed it was too personal, too strange, too dangerous. But after his death, it was published, and it revealed a man who went into the darkness and came back changed, not healed, not enlightened, but more integrated, more whole. Here is what Jung offers. Not a promise that you will be happy, but a promise that you will be real. That if you stop running from your shadow, if you stop pretending you are only light, you will discover something surprising. The darkness is not your enemy. It is part of you. And when you bring it into consciousness, it loses its power to control you. This is not easy, but it is possible, and for many people, it is the only way forward. Let that settle gently. We have moved from Freud's unconscious conflict to Jung's shadow integration, and now we turn to a philosopher who took these psychological insights and combined them with the existential question. Not just, why do I suffer? But, what does it mean to exist at all? Chapter 24, Heidegger and Being Toward Death. Martin Heidegger was born in Germany in 1889. He is one of the most influential and most controversial philosophers of the 20th century. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933. He never fully renounced it, and that fact colors everything he wrote. But his philosophy remains powerful, and his analysis of suffering, specifically his analysis of death, is unmatched. Heidegger believed that most people live inauthentically. They lose themselves in the they, in what one does, in the crowd. You do what is expected, you follow norms. You do not ask who you are or what you want, you just drift. And this drifting creates a kind of background anxiety, a sense that you are not really living, that you are just going through the motions. Heidegger called this mode of existence fallenness, not in a moral sense, but in the sense that you have fallen away from yourself. The cure, he said, is to confront death, not as an abstract concept, but as your death, the death that is coming for you. Heidegger called this being toward death, the awareness that you are going to die, that this life is finite, that time is running out. Most people avoid this awareness. They distract themselves. They pretend death is something that happens to other people. But Heidegger said, if you face it, if you let yourself feel the weight of your mortality, something changes. You stop living for the they. You start living for yourself, because you realize you do not have time to waste on other people's expectations. You become authentic. Not because you are morally superior, but because you are running out of time. And time is the only resource that matters. Suffering, for Heidegger, is often the result of living inauthentically, of spending your life doing things that do not matter to you, of drifting through decades without ever asking, what do I actually want? And then one day you wake up and you realize most of your life is gone and you spent it being someone else. That realization is devastating. It is a kind of existential grief, the grief of the unlived life. But Heidegger believed it is also an opportunity, because once you see it, you can change. You cannot get back the years you wasted, but you can stop wasting the years you have left. Heidegger died in 1976. His relationship with Nazism has made him a difficult figure to reckon with. Some people reject his philosophy entirely because of his politics. Others try to separate the work from the man. But his analysis of death and authenticity remains, and it speaks to anyone who has ever felt like they are living someone else's life. Here is what Heidegger offers. Not comfort, but urgency. The awareness that you are mortal, that your time is limited, and that the only life you can live is your own. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but authentically, in a way that reflects who you actually are, not who you think you should be. This is not easy, but it is freeing, because once you stop living for the they, you stop suffering from their judgment. Let your breath slow for a moment. Heidegger's existentialism was dark, but it was also hopeful, because it said, you can change. You can wake up. You can start living. But another existentialist living in France at the same time took this vision even further. He said, you are not just free to change, you are condemned to freedom. There is no essence, no destiny, no excuse. You are radically free. And that freedom is the source of both your power and your suffering. Chapter 25, Sartre and Existential Freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre was born in Paris in 1905. He was short, ugly, brilliant, and he spent his life arguing that there is no God, no human nature, and no meaning to life except the meaning you create. His central claim, existence precedes essence, meaning this: you are not born with a purpose. You do not have a destiny. You are not designed to be anything. You exist first, and then you create who you are through your choices. This is terrifying, because it means you are responsible for everything. Your life, your happiness, your suffering. You cannot blame God. You cannot blame fate. You cannot blame your childhood or your genes or your circumstances. You can only choose. And every choice defines you. Sartre called this radical freedom, and he said most people cannot bear it, so they live in bad faith. Bad faith is pretending you are not free, pretending you had no choice, pretending you are just following orders or doing what you were told or living up to expectations. But you always have a choice, even when the options are terrible, even when every option involves suffering. You chose to stay in the job you hate. You chose to remain in the relationship that drains you. You chose not to speak up when you should have. Sartre was not saying these choices are easy. He was saying they are yours. And the suffering you feel is not imposed on you. It is the result of your choices. This sounds cruel, but Sartre believed it was liberating. Because if you are the source of your suffering, you are also the source of your freedom. You can choose differently, right now, today. Not without consequences, not without difficulty, but you can. Sartre also wrote about anguish, the feeling that comes from recognizing your freedom. You realize you are responsible. Not just for yourself, but for everyone. Because your choices set examples. They create norms. They shape the world. And that responsibility is crushing. Because no matter what you choose, you are also choosing a vision of humanity. If you lie, you are saying lying is acceptable. If you steal, you are saying property does not matter. If you harm, you are saying harm is justified. Every choice is a vote for the kind of world you want to live in. And that realization creates anguish, because the stakes are so high and the guidance is so minimal. Sartre famously said, "Man is condemned to be free, not blessed, condemned." Because freedom is not a gift, it is a burden, and you cannot escape it. Even choosing not to choose is a choice. Sartre lived his philosophy. He refused honors. He refused money. He wrote plays, novels, essays. He engaged in politics. He fought for causes he believed in. And he lived with Simone de Beauvoir in an open relationship for 50 years. They never married. They were radically honest with each other about their affairs, and they remained partners until his death. He died in 1980. Thousands attended his funeral not because he offered comfort, but because he told the truth. Here is what Sartre offers: not an escape from suffering, but the recognition that you are not a victim. You are a creator, and your life is your project. It will not be perfect. It will not be easy, but it will be yours. And that ownership, that radical responsibility, is the only freedom that matters. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Sartre's existentialism was radical, but his contemporary Albert Camus softened it just slightly. Camus said, "Yes, life is absurd. Yes, it has no inherent meaning, but that does not mean you should despair, because the absurdity itself is the opportunity." Chapter 26, Camus and the Absurd. Albert Camus was born in Algeria in 1913. He grew up poor. His father died in World War I. His mother was deaf and illiterate. He worked his way through school. He became a journalist, a novelist, a playwright, and in 1957 he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. 3 years later, he died in a car accident at 46. Camus is best known for one idea: the absurd. The absurd is the conflict between the human need for meaning and the universe's indifference. You want life to make sense. You want your suffering to have a purpose. You want to matter. But the universe does not care. It does not answer. It does not provide meaning. And that gap between your need and the universe's silence is the absurd. Most people, Camus said, deal with the absurd in one of three ways. First, they commit suicide. They say, "If life has no meaning, I will end it." Second, they commit philosophical suicide. They invent meaning. They adopt a religion or ideology that promises purpose. They convince themselves the universe does care. Third, they embrace the absurd. They accept that life has no meaning, and they live anyway, with passion, with defiance, with joy. Camus called this third option rebellion. Not rebellion against society, rebellion against the absurd itself. The refusal to accept meaninglessness as a reason to stop living. He wrote about Sisyphus, the Greek king condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain. Every time he reaches the top, the boulder rolls back down, and he must start again, forever. This is the absurd, endless repetition, no progress, no escape. And yet Camus ends his essay with one line: "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Why? Because Sisyphus does not need the gods to give his labor meaning. He gives it meaning himself, by choosing to keep rolling the boulder, by defying the punishment, by living fully even in the face of futility. Suffering, for Camus, is inevitable, but despair is optional. You cannot eliminate the absurd, but you can choose how you respond to it. You can rage, you can laugh, you can love, you can create. And in doing so, you do not eliminate suffering, but you transform it into resistance, into art, into life lived on your own terms. Camus also wrote about solidarity. In his novel The Plague, he describes a town quarantined during an epidemic. People suffer, they die, and there is no meaning to the suffering, no lesson, no redemption, but the characters do not give up. They care for each other. They resist the plague, not because they believe they will win, but because it is the right thing to do. And in that resistance, they find something, not meaning, but dignity. Camus believed that the only authentic response to suffering is solidarity. You suffer, I suffer, we all suffer. And we cannot eliminate the suffering, but we can refuse to suffer alone. Here is what Camus offers: not a solution, but a posture. The willingness to live fully in a world that offers no guarantees. To love without the promise that love will last. To create without the belief that creation will endure. And to do all of this, not in despair, but in defiance. Because the universe may not care, but you do. Let that rest gently. Camus' vision is one of the most humane in all of philosophy. It does not promise transcendence, it does not promise redemption, but it promises that you are not alone, and sometimes that is enough. We have now traveled through 25 centuries, from the Buddha to Camus, from the question of suffering to the embrace of the absurd. But before we integrate all of this, there are a few more voices we need to hear. Voices from the 20th century who lived through suffering on a scale that philosophy could barely comprehend. And their insights are some of the most powerful we will encounter. Chapter 27: Simone Weil and Affliction. Simone Weil was born in Paris in 1909. She was a philosopher, a mystic, a political activist, and she spent her life trying to understand suffering from the inside. She taught philosophy, but she also worked in factories to experience the conditions of laborers. She joined the Spanish Civil War. She refused to eat more than the rations available to soldiers in occupied France. She died in 1943 at 34, partially from malnutrition. She had been refusing food as a form of solidarity with those suffering under Nazi occupation. Weil distinguished between suffering and affliction. Suffering is physical pain, loss, hardship. Everyone experiences suffering. It is part of life. Affliction is something else. It is suffering that degrades you, that makes you feel less than human, that isolates you, that makes others turn away. Affliction is not just pain, it is social death. The sense that you no longer matter, that you are invisible, that you are nothing. Weil believed that affliction reveals something about existence, that the universe is not just indifferent, it is crushing. And most people turn away from this truth because it is unbearable. But she did not turn away, she stared into it, and she found something unexpected: grace. Not happiness, not comfort, but the possibility that affliction, when fully experienced, can open you to the divine. She wrote, "The extreme greatness of Christianity lies in the fact that it does not seek a supernatural remedy for suffering, but a supernatural use for it." Meaning this: affliction is not eliminated, but it can be transformed into a kind of communion, a participation in the suffering of the world, a solidarity with all who are afflicted. Weil believed that most people avoid affliction by building walls, wealth, status, distraction, anything to keep the afflicted at a distance. But those walls also cut you off from what is real, from suffering, from grace, from God. And so the path to truth for Weil requires exposure, vulnerability, the willingness to let affliction touch you and to remain human in the face of it. This is not masochism, it is honesty, the recognition that most of the world is afflicted. And if you wall yourself off from them, you wall yourself off from reality. Weil did not live long, but her writings have influenced theologians, activists, and philosophers for decades. Here is what she offers: not a way to avoid suffering, but a way to see it as a doorway, not to escape, but to connection, to solidarity, to the recognition that in the face of affliction, we are all the same. And that recognition, however painful, is also the foundation of love. Let your body rest for a moment. Weil's vision was mystical, but another thinker, living through the same century, approached suffering from a different angle. Not as a mystic, as a survivor, as someone who lived through the worst humanity had to offer and found meaning anyway. Chapter 28. Viktor Frankl and Meaning. We met Viktor Frankl earlier, but now we return to him with more depth, because his answer to suffering is one of the most practical and most enduring in modern philosophy. Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna. He developed a form of therapy called logotherapy, therapy centered on meaning. And then, in 1942, he was arrested by the Nazis. He was sent to Auschwitz. His wife, his mother, his brother, all of them died in the camps. He survived, barely. And after the war, he wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning. It has sold over 10 million copies, and it contains one central insight. Suffering is bearable if it has meaning. Frankl observed that in the camps, the people who survived were not the strongest, not the healthiest. They were the people who had a reason to live, a person to return to, a task to complete, a future to hope for. He wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." This is not a new idea. Nietzsche said it first. But Frankl lived it, and that lived experience gives it weight. Frankl also noticed something else, that suffering can be a source of meaning, not because suffering is good, but because how you respond to suffering defines who you are. You cannot always choose what happens to you, but you can always choose how you respond. In the camps, some people became animals. They stole food from the dying. They betrayed others to save themselves. Others remained human. They shared their last piece of bread. They comforted the dying. They held on to dignity when everything else was taken. And Frankl said, that choice, the choice of who you become in the face of suffering, is the last human freedom. No one can take it from you. After the war, Frankl developed logotherapy into a full system. He taught that neurosis often comes from a lack of meaning, a sense that your life does not matter, and the cure is not pleasure, not success, but purpose. Finding something that makes your life feel worthwhile. Something that gives your suffering a context. This might be a relationship, a creative project, a cause, a child, a belief. It does not matter what it is. What matters is that it pulls you forward, that it makes today's pain feel like part of a larger journey. Frankl died in 1997 at 92. He had lived a long life after the camps. He had married again. He had a daughter. He had written 39 books, and in all of them, he returned to the same idea. Meaning is the antidote to despair. Here is what Frankl offers. Not the promise that suffering will end, but the promise that suffering can be transformed into growth, into purpose, into a life that, despite everything, feels worth living. This is not easy, but it is possible. And for many people, it is the only thing that keeps them going. Let your breath slow. Frankl's vision is hopeful, but it is also demanding, because it asks you to find meaning even when the world gives you none. But another thinker, also living through the 20th century, asked a different question. Not about individual meaning, but about collective responsibility. What happens when suffering is not individual but systemic? When it is not natural but human-made? Chapter 29, Hannah Arendt and Human Responsibility. Hannah Arendt was born in Germany in 1906. She studied philosophy with Heidegger and Jaspers. She fell in love with Heidegger. It was complicated. He was married. He was also a Nazi sympathizer. She fled Germany in 1933. She spent years as a refugee. She eventually settled in New York, and she spent the rest of her life writing about politics, violence, and responsibility. Her most famous work is Eichmann in Jerusalem, about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who organized the logistics of the Holocaust. Arendt attended the trial, and she was struck by something unexpected. Eichmann was not a monster. He was ordinary. He was a bureaucrat. He followed orders. He did his job. And that ordinariness was more terrifying than evil would have been. Arendt called it the banality of evil. Evil is not always dramatic. It is not always intentional. Sometimes it is just ordinary people doing their jobs without thinking about the consequences, following orders, going along, not asking questions. And this realization changes everything about suffering, because it means that suffering is not always caused by villains. Sometimes it is caused by systems, by institutions, by people who are just doing what they are told. And that makes responsibility much harder to assign. Who is responsible for the Holocaust? Hitler? The soldiers? The bureaucrats? The citizens who turned away? Arendt's answer: everyone who participated. Everyone who made it possible. Everyone who did not resist. Suffering on that scale is not the work of one person, it is the work of millions, each playing a small role, each believing they are just following orders. Arendt also wrote about the human condition. She said that humans are defined by three activities: labor, work, and action. Labor is survival, eating, sleeping, reproducing. Work is creation, building, making, leaving something behind. Action is politics, speaking, engaging with others, shaping the world together. Suffering arises when any of these activities is denied or distorted, when labor becomes slavery, when work becomes meaningless, when action is suppressed, and the solution, Arendt believed, is not individual. It is collective. It requires politics, participation, the willingness to speak up, to resist, to hold each other accountable. Arendt died in 1975. She spent her life trying to understand how ordinary people could participate in unimaginable evil. And her answer was sobering. They can, easily, if they stop thinking, if they stop asking questions, if they just follow orders. Here is what Arendt offers: not a way to eliminate suffering, but a way to understand it as a collective responsibility and a call to resist, to refuse to participate in systems that produce suffering, even when it is easier to go along. This is not comfort, but it is a challenge. And for many people, it is the only ethical response to living in a world that systematically produces suffering. Let that settle gently. We have heard from Weil, Frankl, and Arendt, voices from the 20th century who lived through some of the worst suffering humanity has produced. And their insights converge on one idea: suffering is not just individual, it is social, political, collective. And that means the response must also be collective: solidarity, resistance, responsibility. But there is one more voice we need to hear. A voice from modern psychology. Someone who studied how trauma is stored in the body, and how healing requires not just understanding, but safety. Chapter 30. Modern Psychology of Trauma. Bessel van der Kolk is a Dutch-American psychiatrist. He has spent his career studying trauma, not as a psychological concept, but as a physiological reality. His central claim, the body keeps the score, meaning this: traumatic experiences are not stored only in memory. They are stored in the body, in muscle tension, in shallow breathing, in a nervous system stuck in fight or flight. You can talk about the trauma, you can understand it intellectually, but until your body feels safe, the suffering continues. Van der Kolk's work is based on decades of research with veterans, abuse survivors, and people with PTSD. And what he found is that traditional talk therapy is often not enough, because trauma bypasses language. It lodges in the brainstem, in the limbic system, in the parts of the brain that react before you can think. And those parts do not respond to words. They respond to sensation, to movement, to rhythm, to safety signals. This is why trauma survivors often feel like they are overreacting. They know intellectually that they are safe, but their body does not know. Their body is still braced, still scanning for danger, still preparing to flee or freeze. Van der Kolk's work has shown that healing trauma requires somatic practices. Yoga, EMDR, neurofeedback, anything that helps the nervous system recalibrate. Not by thinking differently, but by feeling differently. This is a radical shift in how we understand suffering. For centuries, philosophy has focused on the mind, on changing beliefs, on cognitive reframing. But Van der Kolk is saying sometimes the mind is not the problem, the body is. And the body needs something the mind cannot give it. It needs to feel safe, to discharge the energy that was never released, to complete the fight or flight response that was interrupted. This is not philosophical, it is biological. But it changes the conversation about suffering, because it means that some suffering is not about meaning, it is about physiology, about a nervous system that is stuck in a pattern it cannot escape. And the way out is not through insight, it is through safety, through gentle repatterning, through teaching the body that the danger is over. Van der Kolk's work has influenced a generation of therapists, and it has given hope to people who thought they were broken, who thought they should be able to think their way out of their suffering. He is saying, you are not broken. Your body is doing exactly what it was trained to do, and it can be retrained. Here is what modern trauma psychology offers. Not a philosophy, but a practice. The recognition that suffering is not always in your head. Sometimes it is in your shoulders, your gut, your breath. And healing requires meeting the body where it is, with patience, with safety, with the slow work of teaching it to rest again. Let your body rest for a moment. We have now traveled through 2,500 years, and we have heard dozens of answers to the question of suffering. And now, finally, we arrive at the last chapter, the integration, the place where we hold all of these voices together and ask, what have we learned? Chapter 31, Integration. What 2,500 years revealed? You have been listening for 3 hours. And if you are still awake, or if you drifted and came back, that is fine, because the ideas we have covered are not meant to be memorized. They are meant to settle. So let us take a breath, and let us look back at the entire journey. 2,500 years, 40 thinkers, dozens of answers to one question: why do we suffer? And what we find is not a single answer, but a constellation. The Buddha said, suffering comes from craving, from the grip of desire, and the way out is release. Heraclitus said, suffering comes from resisting change, from trying to step into the same river twice. The Stoics said, suffering comes from attachment, from believing you own what is only on loan. The Christians said, suffering comes from separation, from a broken world waiting for redemption. Descartes said suffering is the gap between mind and body, between thought and flesh. Spinoza said suffering is confusion, the failure to see that everything is necessary. Pascal said suffering is existential, the terror of being conscious in a silent universe. Schopenhauer said suffering is inevitable, the will is blind and insatiable, and the only escape is renunciation. Kierkegaard said suffering is despair, the failure to be yourself, and the cure is faith. Nietzsche said suffering is the price of greatness, and the strong say yes to it. Marx said suffering is systemic, the result of exploitation, and the solution is revolution. Freud said suffering is repressed conflict, and the cure is making the unconscious conscious. Jung said suffering is unintegrated shadow, and the cure is wholeness. Heidegger said suffering is inauthenticity, the failure to live toward death. Sartre said suffering is the weight of freedom, and you are responsible. Camus said suffering is absurd, and you must live anyway. Weil said suffering is affliction, and it can open you to grace. Frankl said suffering is bearable if it has meaning. Arendt said suffering is often collective, and it requires responsibility. Van der Kolk said suffering lives in the body, and healing requires safety. Every answer is true, and every answer is incomplete, because suffering is not one thing, it is many things. Sometimes it is craving, sometimes it is resistance, sometimes it is separation, sometimes it is trauma. And the answer that helps you tonight may not be the answer that helps tomorrow. But here is what all of these voices agree on. Suffering is not meaningless. It may not have a cosmic purpose. It may not be part of a divine plan, but it is significant. It teaches you something about yourself, about the world, about what you value, and how you respond to it defines you more than any other part of your life. You can respond with bitterness or with compassion. You can close down or open up. You can run from it or turn toward it. And that choice, the choice of who you become in the face of suffering, is the only freedom that cannot be taken from you. Now, let us take a moment, a quiet moment, before we move into the practice and the path. Because here, at the end of this long conversation, there is something gentle we can do. Not to solve suffering, but to meet it, to sit with it, and to let it be what it is. Guided practice. Let us pause here, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. Right now, your body is holding you. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe your legs, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head against the pillow. There is nothing to change. Just notice. Now let your breath find its own rhythm. You do not need to make it deeper or slower. Just let it move the way it wants to move. If your mind is busy, that is fine. You do not need to quiet it. Just let it be busy in the background, like a television in another room. For these next few moments, your only task is to feel the weight of your own body, to notice that you are here, that you are breathing, that you are safe enough to simply rest. Think of one thing you have been holding, not the biggest thing, not the loudest thing, just one thing you have been carrying. Now imagine placing it on a shelf across the room. It is still there. You have not erased it, but you are here, and it is over there. Notice the distance. You are not your thoughts. You are not your suffering. You are the one watching them, and the one watching is calm. The one watching has always been calm. Take one slow breath, and let that thought stay on the shelf for now. It will be there tomorrow if you need it, but tonight you do not. And when you are ready, we will continue. 7-day path. You have listened to 25 centuries of philosophy, but philosophy is not just something you understand, it is something you live. So here is a path. 7 days. 7 small practices. None of them dramatic, all of them possible. Day 1. Notice one thought. Today, just notice one thought that repeats. Do not judge it, do not fix it, simply notice it and silently name it. There you are. That is enough for today. Day 2. Feel your feet. At some point today, pause and feel your feet on the ground. Just for 10 seconds. Notice the pressure, the temperature, the contact. This is not meditation. It is a reminder that your body is here, even when your mind is elsewhere. Day 3, one slow breath. Before you respond to something today, a message, a request, a frustration, take one slow breath first, not to calm down, just to create a small space between what happens and how you respond. Day 4, name the feeling. When an emotion arrives today, try to name it with one word, not "I am fine," something more honest, tired, disappointed, relieved. Naming a feeling is not the same as solving it, but it changes how you carry it. Day 5, let one thing go. Choose one thing today that you have been holding on to, a small grudge, a minor frustration, an unfinished argument, and let it be unresolved, not forever, just for today. See what it feels like to set it down. Day 6, kindness without reason. Do one small kind thing today that nobody will see. Hold a door. Let someone go first. Speak gently to yourself when you make a mistake. Notice how kindness feels in your body, not just in your mind. Day 7, sit with stillness. Tonight, before sleep, sit or lie in silence for 2 minutes. No phone, no audio, just you and the dark. Let whatever comes, come. You do not need to make this profound. You just need to let it be quiet. And trust that quiet is enough. Final reflection. We began tonight with a question. Why do we suffer? And what we found is that the question is more important than any single answer. Because asking the question means you are still curious, still searching, still willing to sit with what is hard instead of running from it. The philosophers we met tonight, they were not special. They were people like you. They struggled, they doubted, they lay awake at night wondering if any of it made sense. But they asked the question, and in asking it, they found something, not certainty, but clarity, not happiness, but dignity. And that is what this entire conversation has been about. Not eliminating suffering, but meeting it with clear eyes. Not pretending it does not exist, but refusing to let it define you. You have suffered, you will suffer again. That is not a flaw. That is life. But you are not just the person who suffers, you are also the person who listens, who reflects, who asks why, who keeps going. And that person, the one who keeps going, is stronger than you think. So tonight, as you rest, let this be enough. You listened. You stayed. You let these ideas wash over you, and maybe one of them will stay with you, not as a solution, but as a companion, a voice in the dark that says, you are not alone. Others have walked this path, and they survived. And so will you. Sleep well, rest gently. And when you wake, remember, suffering is not the end of the story. It is just one chapter, and you are still writing.